A very good evening, everyone. I hope you're all keeping well. So, in today's webinar, we're going to look at two very important skills, listening and speaking, at CEFR levels A2 to B2. We're also going to look at how these skills are tested through the ISE exam, and also some tools and strategies that we can use in the classroom in order to help our learners deal with these processes better. But one disclaimer, this is not an exhaustive session on listening and speaking. We're going to cover a few key areas, and we're going to start with listening first and then move on to speaking. So I really wanted to share this one slide with all of you to bring into perspective how important listening is as a skill. Unfortunately, it tends to be given the short shrift. Some of us think it's quite easy and that we can master it overnight by practicing a couple of times once in a while. This is one skill that makes the heaviest processing demands. So think about it. When you're listening, you're not just listening. You're decoding phonological information. You're storing it in the short-term memory. You are trying to understand what you've heard. And all of it is happening in real time. So if you don't understand something, the speaker is not going to stop. The tape is not going to stop to give you thinking time. So this can often cause a little bit of anxiety and stress among listeners. So all the more reasons for us teachers to give those tools to our learners so that they can deal with it a little better. And that's exactly what I'm going to do in a bit. But let's quickly have a look at the processes in listening. So if I show you a photo like this and I go, Hajimemashite, watashi wa Somapodar desu. Indo no Hyderabad ni sundete, Trinity College London de hataraite imasu. Now, you may or may not understand what I've just said, but you can definitely guess from context what this is about. So you are applying your background knowledge to understand that maybe this conversation along with the photograph has something to do with general introduction, right? Now, let's look at another example. So I show you a photo of a convenience store with a store clerk and a customer, and I ask you to predict what the conversation can be about. So you're automatically thinking about maybe a buying or a transaction script, something on the lines of, is this what you want? Or can I help you? Which is universal in any language. So again, what you're doing is you're applying your background knowledge, you're trying to predict or guess what's going to come next based on your background knowledge. And this is top-down process in listening. So in top-down process, you're activating your schemata, your emotions, your memory, different linguistic resources, background knowledge in order to understand something. And this is a very, very important skill in real-life listening because even for advanced level learners, if they miss a word or if they do not understand an unknown vocabulary, which is quite normal, they can apply their knowledge of context in order to guess what the meaning of that word would be or the overall understanding of that listening text. Now, one more photo to go, one more picture, and you see that there are two people here, and maybe they're trying to, one person is giving directions to the other. This is the exact opposite of top-down because here you're trying to listen intensively for details and you're focusing on the language, the even sounds and maybe a few words here and there. Now, for any listening, real-life listening situation, our learners will have to use a combination of both these processes. And any listening test will use a mix of these two, bottom-up and top-down processes. So let's see an example. So I'm going to show you a task from ISE 1, and I've picked it up randomly. So if you can have a look at task 2. So it's a combination of both processes using just listening as well as listening for details. Now, while we are on the subject of exams, let's also see how listening is tested through ISE. So listening is tested along with speaking in an integrated manner through different kinds of speaking tasks like topic, collaborative, and conversation tasks. Listening is also tested independently or discretely to demonstrate how we listen to lectures in classrooms, etc. Now, all the discrete listening tasks are scaffolded to each level in ISE. So at the basic and the more at the lower levels, discrete listening is more factual, it's more framed. So the candidate has to listen to something, respond to questions, report orally, has to respond to further questions. So at no point of time is the candidate just ticking off boxes or responding to multiple choice questions. They have to listen and respond orally. And at the higher levels in ISE, the listening tasks are more abstract. So candidates will have to be able to read between, listen between the lines, will have to infer meanings, will have to report arguments for or against something. So it's more abstract as you go higher up the levels. ISE is also the only qualification that tests interactive listening, which is essentially when a listener, when a candidate is involved in an interactive listening, he takes an active role in the process. So they're not just listening and answering questions or ticking off boxes. They have to participate, will have to respond to questions, report information, negotiate meaning with the examiner. So this is why ISE is so very unique. Now, let's have a quick look at some very essential skills that learners need in order to do well in any listening examination. The first, of course, is global listening, which is a very common kind of question in any exam. So global listening is where you're listening only for the bigger picture. You're not going into details. And this is a classic example of a top-down process that we've just discussed. So you're listening, you're activating your background information or your schemata. You're also assigning a gist to that particular listening text. So which is why just listenings are included in most listening exams. That's because when the correct schemata is activated, when the correct gist is assigned or established, then your brain space becomes free and you can focus or tune into narrow or more specific information. And this is also why in a lot of exams, the listening audio is repeated twice. So in the first instance, in the first time, candidates are encouraged to give just a gist to the listening text, and then they listen again, take down notes, and then answer a more specific and narrow, detailed, intensive questions. So how do we practice this with our students? How do we get them to be aware of just listening? So the first thing they need to, of course, understand that it's not necessary to understand everything, every word, meanings. You're trying to get the bigger picture, and you can do that without getting into every word. The other thing, of course, is when you're listening to something, the most important things will always be emphasized or stressed. So you need to train your ears to pick on these clues. And the third is the simplest. There are clues in the language. All discourse, in any discourse, you will have these clues in the form of signal words. So it could be connectors, it could be sequencers. So you need to be more aware of these signposting language, which will ultimately lead you to your main gist. And it'll also help you to predict what's coming next. Now, once your students have intensified these, internalized these tips, then you can go and do practice a few activities with your learners to include gist listening. So the first activity is more of a pre-listening task, and I've mentioned how important it is to activate your schemata or your background knowledge. So you can choose anything. You can choose, say, a news article, a listening file, and instead of playing it, you just show your class that you're only going to give them the headline or the basic prompt, and they have to discuss in pairs what they think, or what they have to predict what they think the listening task is going to be about, what the listening text is about. So what you're doing here is not just a prediction. You're also getting your learners to be aware of the schemata, they're activating their schemata, and they'll see that their brain will automatically help them in connecting the dots to get to the gist. The second activity is my all-time favorite for any listening task, and I'm going to go on like a broken record about this. It's dictogloss. And the reason why I like dictogloss is because it's versatile, and you can combine a lot of skills with when you're practicing dictogloss. So you can combine a listening and speaking. You can do a listening writing as well as a speaking. And it's also very useful for teachers because you need minimum preparation for this. All you need is a good text. All you need is a good recording. And if you're reading off a text, it's better if you can keep it at your own pace. Don't slow down, because that will defeat the whole purpose. So when you're practicing a dictogloss for gist, what you need to do is get your learners to work in groups, in pairs, and they don't need to take notes at this point. So you play the text or you read the text, they have to listen to it, and they work in pairs to give you a 2 or a 3 sentence summary of what the gist is about, what the general meaning of the text is about. They can include 1 or 2 details, but at this point, details is not really important. I'm going to come back again to dictogloss when I talk about listening for details. The third activity is to bring or focus attention to signposts. So what all you need to do is maybe get a transcript of your listening text, and thanks to technology and the internet, that's very easily available. All you need to do is blot out the signposting language in the transcript and give it to your students. They listen to the text and they fill in. So it's more like a dictation. Wherever there are signposts, they fill in that signal word. So this will become a little bit of a habit for them to see how important it is in discourse, how important it is to predict what will come later in the text. Right. Now, coming to listening for details, here you're obviously more interested in specific kind of information. It could be numbers, words, names, emotions, colors, anything. And it's a lower order listening skill, but it's quite common in a lot of listening exams. So in order to practice listening for detail, we're going to maybe get our learners, it's quite, to get your learners to be a part of this activity, they can choose what they want to practice with. So you could choose maybe a sports news or a weather report. Here, they have to take down notes, and they're going to listen to maybe names of places, weather conditions, temperatures, or if you choose their favorite sport, they're going to look for the latest results. So that will again be, so you're basically practicing listening for details here. And I'm going to come again to dictogloss, but dictogloss for specific information is different from dictogloss for gist. Here, your students will have to work on their own, not in pairs, and they have to take notes. So you read a text or you play something, they have to take notes, and they have to reconstruct it in their own words, and the reconstruction has to be as close to the original as possible. So now they have to include details. So what you're doing through something like this is practicing listening, writing, as well as speaking. Now, after my students have a good idea about dictogloss, I also do something called a reverse dictogloss, and this is more student-led. So I give each of them some theme, and it can be the same theme repeated with other students as well, that's fine. But they have to do a little bit of a homework, so they go back and they do a bit of research on the theme that I've given them. It doesn't have to be a lot of research, just some basic more information about it. They come back to the class, and with their partner, they do an oral presentation on the theme that was given to them. And the partner has to take notes and have to reconstruct the text in their own words. But in order for your partner to be able to do full justice to it, you have to have good pronunciation, your delivery has to be good so that it is intelligible to the person who's listening to you. So it's a great activity. I think if you can give it a shot once in a while, your students will become more aware of these different kinds of skills. And coming to the third skill, which is more of a higher order listening skill, inference, where you're listening between the lines, you're listening to something that's not obviously stated. So again, what you're doing is you are using clues in the language, you're using your background knowledge in order to conclude something. So I've taken a very, very simple example. So imagine a conversation between a daughter and a mother. And the daughter says, I'm stepping outside to get some fresh air. And the mom says, it's quite hot outside, isn't it? Now, obviously, if we are listening between the lines, we can figure out that the mother doesn't want the daughter to go outside because it's hot outside, but she's not saying it. So this is an example, a very simple example of inference, and your students need to get used to this as they go higher up the levels. So a simple but a fun way to practice inference is maybe to pick any show or any popular movie, a TV show that your students like, right? But maybe you can pull it out from YouTube, which is so very simple these days. And you, instead of playing it, instead of watching it, they're going to just listen to it. And you can pause every now and then if it's too much for lower level learners and they have to infer what is taking place, what the characters are talking about, what their relationship is. And then they watch it maybe upon a second time and then check whether their inferences or their predictions were correct or not. You could even stop after every 2 sentences or 2 or 3 sentences and ask them to predict what they think would come next. So it's a great way to practice inference. It's a great way to practice prediction questions as well, and your students are going to love it. Right. So it's all good to know about skills. It's good to know about processes, but there's something very, very basic that your learners need to be taught when they're doing a listening task. And that is the ability to take good notes. So when you're listening, there's already a huge load on your cognitive memory because you're listening for details, courtesy of information, text. But when you're taking good notes, that will help to lessen the load on your cognitive memory. Now, this may or may not come easily for everyone, and it certainly didn't come for me. So your students need your help. And this, again, note-taking is quite a complex task if you think about it. It's not as easy as it's made to be, because when you're taking notes, you are selecting key information, you are making connections, you're reviewing, you're summarizing, you're even discarding irrelevant information. So it's quite a complex process, and these are all essential 21st century skills, which is why a lot of universities these days are including guidance on note-taking for their new students. But why wait for your students to get to university when you can do it in school with them, even with your middle school students? And I've done it, so I can say confidently that you can definitely do it. Now, I'm going to take you through some very, very simple 3 strategies you can use in your daily lessons in order to take good notes. But let's also go through a few pointers first. When your students are listening to something, it's important that they know why they're listening to it. So that will help them to know how to listen. So just to give you an example, if I say that this lecture is about the advantages and disadvantages of note-taking, well, there are no disadvantages, but still. So you'll immediately know that your notes will have to be in columns. Or say if I say it's about for or against something, it has to be in columns. So you know why you're listening, and then you devise your notes according to that. Encourage your learners to take notes in their own words and not verbatim. And it may not come that easily, especially for lower level middle school students, but you can definitely coax them into taking notes in their own words. write phrases, keywords, use your own abbreviations. It doesn't have to be follow the norm. As long as you understand it, it's fine. Use symbols, bullet points, and also pay heed to signal words when you're taking notes, because they are, like I mentioned before, will lead you to what the speaker actually wants to talk about. Right. So again, once they know these things, it will be easier for them to follow the three strategies that we're going to discuss now. The first is the Cornell method, which is very, very useful, especially if you want to take neat notes, if you want your notes to be well organized and you want to pull out key concepts later for reference, for further studies. It is very useful. So all you need to do is divide your note into two columns. So the first one third is your Q column, where you introduce keywords, you introduce terminologies, main concepts, and the wider column is your outline column, where you take notes, you add notes which are associated with these keywords. And right at the bottom, you also include a summary, of a note or summary. You can even include footnotes, you can include something, a note to self. It include questions that you want to ask your teacher later, maybe in your next class. So it's versatile and it's really, really useful. I'd recently done it with students from class 6, and I thought that it would be a little difficult, but they got to it very, very easily. So try something like this if you're not doing it already. Mind mapping is another very useful note-taking strategy. We generally associate mind map with brainstorming, but it's also quite a useful and very easy way to take notes. All you need to do is keep your central topic, your heading, at the center, and you keep on adding, say, main information and more details in the form of branches that radiate outward away from the center. Again, use keywords, don't use long sentences because that's going to be very confusing. The reason why mind mapping is useful is because it's easy, it's a visual summary, so it's going to stay with you, and it's also easy to recall information when you see something visual. And the last strategy is the charting method, which is a more common method that we all use at some point of time or the other, but now we're going to do it more consciously. At the basic, charting method will have two columns. So you have your main idea and your supporting ideas, or you have different descriptors like advantages, disadvantages, and you keep adding notes according to these descriptors. So I really, and I sincerely hope you can use these strategies in your class. And the one way to make sure that your students are applying this is to maybe do a listening task and get them to volunteer or tell you what kind of strategy they've used in order to take that note, so they become more aware, it becomes a practical, so you're modeling it for them. Right. So coming to the last bit here, a lot of times we get asked by teachers where they can get different kinds of listening text, different listening activities to practice from. One, of course, Trinity website, we've mentioned it many, many times before as well, has a lot of resources. You don't have to do an ISE. You can take any listening text from there, practice it with your students. Or there's one very beautiful website called listenwise.com. So it's got amazing podcasts, so interesting ones, and there are lots of interactive quizzes, and your students can navigate through that if you're doing it online, and they can tell you what they want to listen to. So choose a podcast, and I would recommend that you also do a speaking activity along with this, integrate speaking with this, so that they can listen, they can do a little bit of research and do an oral presentation in front of their class or with their groups, with their partners, whatever they are comfortable with. BreakingNewsEnglish.com, again, I had mentioned this in my webinar on reading. So this website has lots of semi-authentic text, so in the form of news articles and It's great because if you want to do reading, you can start off with a reading text, or you could go ignore the reading bit and go directly to the listening section, which has the same news but not in the form of reading. So again, there are pre-listening tasks, there are different interactive questions. You can even do multiple choice questions if that's what you want. So it's got everything there. It's very, very nice. And the best thing is it also has listening tasks according to levels. So there are beginner level tasks, there's intermediate as well as advanced levels. This AmericanLife.org is something I'm sure your students are going to love because it's got amazing podcasts, it's got episodes in the form of TV shows. So you can make them listen to it, and they're very interesting. I've done it a couple of times myself. Again, it's the whole point of doing a listening task is not, of course, to just have fun, but you can stop every now and then and do all the activities that I had mentioned earlier to do, just listening for details. At least it'll have their attention going because they're interesting podcasts. And last but not the least, you have BBC, TED, TEDx, British Council. They're a great repository of information. Use it for expository tasks. If you want to practice on information text, you can always use these resources. So we have covered listening. Now we need to move to speaking. And in ISE, there are many speaking tasks, and all of these increase in length as well as complexity as you move higher up the levels. But two tasks that are common across all levels is the topic task and the conversation task. And the collaborative task gets added from ISE 2. So we're going to do all of it, look at all of these tasks separately, individually. But before I move into all of these tasks, I need to mention something here, that ISE and GESE are English language exams. So there is a focus on language. So you can't just say anything you want. There has to be some coverage of the language functions and grammar that's mentioned in the handbook, in the syllabus for whichever level your students are at. So I've just pulled out ISE 1 to show you what it looks like. So at ISE 1, you have a few language functions and grammar that your students will have to use. It looks like a lot, but there are some very simple ones like asking for clarification, responding to requests for clarifications. So your learners will need to know these language, and you as a trainer will also have to know what language is needed at that level if you're training your students for an ISE or a GESE exam. Right. So now let's have a look at the different tasks. The topic task lasts for about 5 minutes. This is one task where the candidate prepares a topic in advance of the exam, chooses a topic, and the candidate and the examiner will then have a dialogic conversation, which is highly personalized and which gives the candidate a lot of control. Now, this is not a test. So even though you have thought about what you want to say, it's not a one-sided conversation, it's not a recitation, it's not a Q&A, not a scripted Q&A. So the examiner and the candidate will co-construct the task, which is what makes this task extremely authentic. And this is also one task that's quite popular with our learners, with candidates, because they've had the chance to think about what they want to talk about, to organize their ideas. So it takes the stress off the exam. And this ties in very well with Bias for Best, which is a theme for all our exams in Trinity. Now, let's see what you should keep in mind when you are preparing for a topic task. The first thing, like I mentioned, is you have to choose a topic that's personalized, which has something to do with you, but don't make it too technical because you will end up alienating the examiner. So choose something that will lead to a spontaneous discussion. Choose something that will give the examiner a chance to ask you lots of interesting questions. The second thing is, of course, that you need to demonstrate the language functions and grammar of the grade or the level that you're appearing for. I have shown you an example of the language functions you have at IC1. Similarly, you have it for every level, and you have to use that in your topic, in your conversation. I'm going to show how to do it in a bit also. So when you prepare a topic, at IC Foundation and 1, there are printed topic forms that are given to you, which is obligatory. But at the higher levels, you can come with your own mind map, and you choose 3 or 4 or 5 discussion points in that mind map. The examiner will choose any randomly and ask you to talk about it. And you have to answer with a long turn. You have to answer with at least 3 or 4 sentences, and I'm going to show you what a long turn is. But you cannot answer, just give maybe 1 word or a 1 sentence answer. And the last thing you have to remember is you have to at least ask the examiner 1 question. This makes it truly authentic. This is what an interaction should look like. Right. So what is long turn? So when 2 people talk in any conversation, one person may have to speak for a longer period of time if he has to give reasons or clarify doubts that the other person has had, or maybe give some more information about the topic. This is conversational turn taking. So you need to when to give and when to take a turn. And this is exactly what you'll be doing in the topic as well as in the conversation task. The examiner will ask questions. You have to respond with a long turn. The examiner will ask you follow-up questions. So even though you've prepared the topic, you don't know what the examiner is going to ask you. Right. So let's have a look at a sample topic. So again, I've just chosen a very simple one for you to have some idea about it. So I've chosen my favorite teacher as my topic. Now, at IC1, you need 4 discussion points. So these are your discussion points, but I've chosen 5 because I want to show you that there is one which is no good and I want to get rid of it eventually. So is this topic personalized? Absolutely. We're talking about my favorite teacher. Mine makes it personalized. So let's look at the points. The examiner is going to choose any randomly and ask you to talk about it, and you'll have to respond with a long turn. So if I have a point like her or his name, is this a good point? Absolutely not, because you can't use a long turn. My favorite teacher's name is Mr. Chawla. That's the most I can say. Or his qualifications or his age. It will not let me use any of the language of the level that I'm at. And it will definitely not let me talk for more than maybe a sentence or 2. So I'm not going to keep this point. On the other hand, the other 4, why I like her so much, our school trip next month, these are good points. So if the examiner, for example, asks me, why do you like her so much? I could definitely say, I like her a lot because she is one of the loveliest people, one of the kindest people I've ever come across. And I also like it that she doesn't give homework. So have I spoken in 2 or 3 sentences? I can speak for more, but yes, it's a long turn. It will allow me to use long turns. And I've also used 1 or 2 language from that level. So I have used likes and dislikes. I like Mr. Chawla, or I love Mr. Whoever. I've also used she never gives us homework. So and she's one of the best teachers I've come across. I'm using comparisons here. So I'm good if I can use 2 or 3 language items, language functions in each point. And this will lead to further questions by the examiner. And then I'll have to report or respond with a long turn. So what kind of activities can we do in order to practice or in order to train our students for a topic task? Now, because it's so heavily personalized, the whole topic phase, any kind of communicative activity that is personalized will really help your students. But you have to keep 3 things in mind when you're preparing your learners. The first stage is when they're brainstorming for the topic. What topic am I going to talk about? The second is the language coverage. What kind of language am I going to use? And the third is what kind of questions will I ask the examiner? So any activity that is personalized will help you. So you can use role-playing activities. You can get your students to share what kind of books they've read, movies they've watched, what they like, what they don't like, either in pairs or in small groups. And this should be good in order to get at least the ball rolling. There's one activity that I find quite useful, which I found from our website. Please check out the Trinity website. It's got plenty of and more resources, and feel free to use it in your communicative classrooms. So this is a 5-point star activity, a very simple one. So the 5 points on the star represent 5 things about me, and I'm going to model it for my students, and they have to guess why these 5 things are important to me by asking me questions. But they have to remember that whatever question they ask, I have to be able to answer with a long turn. And I also would hope that I can use the language of that level. So if I have Rochelle and I say, if your students ask a question like, who is Rochelle? That will be a little difficult for me. Yes, I can elaborate on it, but if you tweak the question a little bit and ask, why is Rochelle your friend? Or why is Rochelle your best friend? Or how long have you known Rochelle for? Or do you prefer learning new languages to traveling? That will automatically give me an option, give me a chance to use long term and also use the language of that level. Now, once you have modeled it for your students, they can do the same thing with their partner. They talk about their own stars, they create their own stars, and their partners will have to ask them similar questions. And after this is done, this is a brilliant warm-up to get to actual topic generation. Then they start thinking about what topic they want to talk about, what personalized topics, because you're not going to select the topic for them. They're going to come up with their own topic, make it personalized, and select different discussion points. They can have as many as they want, and then narrow it down to the best 4 or 5 and present it to the examiner. So that was speaking in a nutshell. We're also going to have a look at the collaborative task now. And like I've mentioned, this gets included from ISE 2. So the collaborative task is a lot similar to your interactive task in Jessie. And for this, the examiner reads out a prompt. So the prompt can be a discussion, a situation, a dilemma prompt, and the candidate and the examiner will create a dialogue around the prompt. Here, the candidate is on the driver's seat. They have to bring the conversation to a logical conclusion, ask questions. They're the ones who are driving the conversation forward. Now, for this task, the examiner comes with a backstory for whichever prompt that they've chosen. The backstory is an imagined story, and it's the candidate's responsibility to elicit that backstory from the examiner. Now, there are a couple of things that learners need to remember when they're doing a task like this, because this is for about 4 minutes, and 4 minutes is a long time. So you have to remember that you need to ask relevant questions. You cannot make yourself the subject of this task. You're not at the center. It's the examiner whose problem and dilemma or situation is the crux of the issue. You can't make it about yourself. And you have to bite down the urge to give a suggestion or advice right at the start, because the moment you do that, the conversation is going to come to a close. So you have to time it, you have to ask questions, you find more details, and then you move to the examiner's problem. So let's have a quick look at the things that you need to remember. One thing that will help you with this task is if you can mentally divide the prompt into smaller parts, into smaller chunks, and I'm going to come to this in a bit. You have to be able to make it interactive with the examiner, and like I've mentioned, it's not you who's talking for 4 minutes, it's the examiner and you who are constructing the dialogue. So you have to make him or her a part of this interaction. You're not going to talk for 4 minutes. Interact with the examiner, ask relevant questions, take responsibility to drive or maintain the conversation. And last but not the least, don't give advice or suggestions right away. Now, let's have a look at a sample prompt. So if the examiner gives you a prompt like this, my local college has a great range of courses and I'd really like to study something, but I'm not sure which course to take. So the moment you listen to a prompt like this, what you could do is, instead of fixating on one or two parts of the prompt, divide it mentally into smaller parts. So let's have a look at what I've done here. So I've divided it into, my local college has a great range of courses. I'd really like to study something, and I'm not sure which course to take. So there are distinct points here, 3 divisions here, and then you can target your questions to each of these 3 points. So let's see. I could ask the examiner lots of questions about the college that he selected. Is it a reputed one? What kind of faculty members do you have? So the next part again, what kind of course modules do you see which would be interesting for you? So you're trying to get more information, genuine information about different parts of the prompt. Or you say, what are the courses that are offered? So you get a chance to know more about the examiner's situation here. And then you can put your energy on the problem, which is, I'm not sure which course to take. So based on all the information that you've collected, all the probing that you've done, you can go on to give a suggestion or bring it to a conclusion, depending on the kind of prompt that you've been given. So if you can get your students to do this, the chunking, it really helps them, because oftentimes what happens is, in a hurry, students forget the other parts of the prompt. They want to fixate on only one part. Okay, my college, or I don't know what to take. But there is more to the prompt than just one bit. When we are preparing learners for a task like a collaborative task, we are not just testing language competence, we are testing strategic competence, which is the ability to use different kinds of strategies to repair a breakdown in communication. So this is what makes the task extremely relevant. You're preparing your learners for authentic skills. You're preparing your learners to think out of the box, most importantly. So what kind of activities can you do? You can, I'm going to ask Dale to share some sample prompts from our website with you. You can take these prompts and you can divide your classroom into different groups. So one group is in charge of thinking about the imagined story or the backstory, and the other group or other smaller groups will ask questions to elicit that backstory from the other group. Or you could also maybe do activities, simulate an exam. So you could break them into the groups into 2 or 3 candidates. So one person is the examiner, the other is the candidate, and another is the judge, to see if both the parties are asking relevant questions, if they're giving advice right at the beginning or not. And the other thing which I have mentioned here is use sample videos to get your learners to see what the task is actually about. So you see a sample video from the website, and you can stop every, say, 2 or 3 minutes and ask them if they can better the question that the candidate has asked the examiner. So if there is anything they could do better. So this will get them to feel what the real collaborative task is all about. Right, so coming to the last task in the speaking section, it's the conversation task, which is common across all levels like the topic task. And it lasts for about 2 or 3 minutes, and the examiner chooses one subject area from the syllabus, from the specifications, and will ask questions, will initiate a discussion with the candidate, and the candidate has to come back with long turns, speak with long turns. And this is genuinely interactive, genuinely a co-constructed task, and there has to be coverage of the language as well. So it's not just a one-sided Q&A question. It's not a scripted or a memory task like you normally would think it is. So that brings us to the end of this webinar.